Hello again, and welcome to another edition of Bite-Sized Kierkegaard. I almost forgot the name of it. This is a continuing series going through all of Kierkegaard's works, which is a lot. In his short life, he produced a lot of works, going through it in chronological order. Some of them I'm reading for the first time, like this one, The Concept of Irony, which we're finishing today. But yeah, if you want a brief introduction of why I'm doing this video series and all that, click on the link below, and the very first video explains it and sets it up. But just to sum up, basically, I'm not an authority in any of this. I'm not a scholar. Um, I'm just reading through it. I'm just a guy. I'm just reading through it and explaining things that I find interesting. So there's going to be things that I leave out that I don't think are that interesting, that might be vital or that might resonate with other people. So read it for yourself, basically. Judge for yourself. Which is like a little name dropping of a future book, which we'll get to eventually. Yeah, but yeah, we're continuing with the concept of irony today, and I realized that we didn't actually make it through all of part one the last time, even though I kind of jumped the gun basically. So we're actually starting in my edition on page 157, which is the actualization of the view, talking about the daimon of Socrates. And just a note on the page numbers. Page numbers are going to be different depending on the edition you have, which I realized halfway through going through this. In the future, I'm going to switch to doing the original page numbers, which in my edition, I can see them listed on the side here in the margin. But for consistency with the previous video, I'm going to stick with the page numbers in my hardcover edition of the Hong translation. Yes, we're into Hong territory. So yeah, basically, just to set this up, to kind of recap last time, this is Kierkegaard's master's thesis, and he's trying to get at what is irony. And in part one, kind of saying, hey, Socrates is an interesting character. There's a lot of overlap in what he did with, what I consider irony. If you see like a Venn diagram, there's a pretty good overlap. Part two is acknowledging that maybe that overlap is not 100%. Maybe it's not one to one. Maybe there's some things in irony that are not revealed in Socrates' character. So in part two, it's going to try to get at that and trying to suss it out more. Yeah, and just for a little bit of background context, there is a lot of historical context with the Greeks in general. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. I recommend learning a little bit about that, just to overview about what that was, what it was all about. But you don't need to know it all for now. But all you need to know now is that Socrates was kind of an anti-authoritarian figure who was kind of questioning everything, almost kind of a skeptic in a way. Um, you know, just going around town, kind of bugging people. He's called the gadfly. In Athens, people who were so sure of themselves and making them break down with tears sometimes. So really challenging the status quo, to the point where it got him in a lot of trouble. He got locked up, and then it was a pretty pure democratic system where there was a vote, and he was sentenced to be put to death. But it need not have happened that way. I kind of think it's suspicious. Like it's almost like a suicide by cop, but he kind of became like a martyr of philosophy. He had chances to escape. He could have escaped if he wanted to. Kierkegaard kind of talks about that a bit, but it's sort of like, where would he go to? Because he would just go to another city and stir up trouble there. Like his very existence was problematic for any of these societies because it was just anti-authoritarian. It was kind of disrespectful of that authority, to the point where they're saying, hey, this guy's like even an atheist. He doesn't even believe in the gods, which isn't quite true. Like, and this first discussion kind of is an acknowledgement of that. There's kind of like an inner divine spirit in Socrates, the Daimon of Socrates, which is kind of a weird thing if you think about it today. But if you think about it as like your conscience, it's not that weird. Something that sort of guides you and tells you, hey, you probably shouldn't be doing this. Kind of like reminding you, setting you straight, basically. Kind of in a negative way, not ever in a positive way, saying, hey, you should go do this. Like it's always like, hey, you're about to do something wrong and you probably should think about that. So there's some discussion of this Socrates' daimon on page 158. And it's this interesting thing. It's indescribable. It's almost like a mystical, abstract thing. But the real problem, the thing that got Socrates in trouble, is it really just challenges authority, which Kierkegaard mentions on page 160. Um, yeah, and page 159 I already explained. The daimon is always a warning, like a negative, not ever like a positive, like commanding him to do something. Um, but and there's some interesting discussion on page 169 also. Yes, okay, Socrates rejects these traditional gods, but it's not necessarily atheism. Um, it's just kind of like Socrates' basic position is just challenging everything. Again, on page 218, which is skipping ahead a bit, Socrates' whole life is a protest, Kierkegaard says. And so just a bit of some interesting things that come out about irony before we move on to part two. Basically, on page 178, I like the language here, so I brought it out. There's this language of a dialectical vacuum pump. Let me bring this up because I like the language, and this popped out at me. Like, Kierkegaard definitely has a way with words and with these analogies, so I'm going to let this sort of speak for itself. But let's see here. So talking about Socrates, therefore he placed individuals under his dialectical vacuum pumped away the atmospheric air they were accustomed to breathing, and left them standing there. For them, everything was now lost, except to the extent that they were able to breathe ethereal air. Socrates, however, had nothing more to do with them, but hastened on to new adventures. So that's also the idea that, like, okay, Socrates is here he's going to vacuum pump away all their confidence, everything that they built up, and say, hey, no, like, you should probably, like, challenge these assumptions that you have, like, this might be the truth, and we should pursue the truth. I won't quote it, but there's another analogy on page 190 about a woodcutter. Socrates is like going into the forest, cutting down all the woods, so you can kind of clear the view. You can see the view basically, but all the woods are kind of like the things that are blocking your view to the truth, and it's all these like things that you've been grown up to led to believe and everything. And I left a note here that this and the dialectical vacuum pump are really kind of reminders for me of what little I know of Zen Buddhism, that it's a similar thing, that it's sort of like, the view of the child is kind of more pure because they haven't built up all this, they haven't gotten accustomed to that air, or they haven't gotten accustomed to those trees that are built up blocking the view, all those foundation, all those systems and everything. And then Socrates wants to come along and say, hey, we should clear this out. Let's vacuum out the air. Let's cut down these trees so we can see the view. Get back to sort of our roots. Let's challenge everything. And so it's very similar to the Zen Buddhism concept. A few other things which I might bring up in a bit, but that's and a little bit of a jab at Hegel on page 239 before we move on to part two. Basically saying Hegel kind of just ignores that, Socrates kind of has this divine mission in him. His whole life was a protest, and Hegel kind of ignores this. It's just sort of like, he doesn't get it, basically. So it's a jab at Hegel. Not the last one, as we'll see. It's the first of many. So now getting into part two. As I said before, if you think of the Venn diagram, here's irony, here's Socrates. There's some overlap, but it's probably not 100%. So what are things that are missing? That's the purpose of part two. Like, what are things that aren't overlapping in this irony when we explain this? So I'll start with some things that popped out about irony first, and then I'll move on to some very Kierkegaardian themes just to highlight them. So just kind of blasting through this. Page 270, irony is infinitely light. It's like playing with nothing. This should sound familiar from last time. It's earnestness about nothing. Page 279, irony is without roots. It can start over again if it wants to. Again, it's kind of that tree analogy again. Without the roots, it's kind of like clearing away. It's like the woodcutter. Irony is free from both good and bad. That's another one that definitely is it reminded me of the Zen Buddhism. I read this book. There's just a summary, kind of like a beginner's introduction, but it's just sort of beyond logic. It's beyond good and bad. It's beyond these dichotomies. It's just, like it's starting to go into kind of the mystical realm where you can't really talk about it, and that is kind of, it is kind of scary at that point because it's like, well, you can't reason about it. What are you talking about? Like, can we even talk about some of this stuff? Um, at page 280, irony's great requirement is to live poetically. Again, yeah, this talk about the poetic life, which we'll see more of in either or. The poetic life is very much like the life of the aesthetic. There's very much overlap there. When we talk about the different stages of living, you'll hear about, we three main stages for Kierkegaard: the aesthetic, which is kind of like the poetic existence; the ethical, which is the, in either or, it's sort of like the married man who's kind of settled down, and then something that we get later on developed, which is the religious life, which is like, okay, this is what it's about. This is living life for God, and there's not really, we'll get into this more, but there's not really clear cut distinction. There's some overlap, and it's not super clear, but like, because you can live kind of poetically in a religious way as well. Um, anyway, well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but when he's talking about the poetic life, that's a little hint to that. Um, page 282, for the ironist, all is possible, like God in heaven. That was something that was like, woof, like, it's like the ironist on earth has everything possible because, like, there's no limitations. There's nothing that says, okay, this says you shouldn't do this. And this is problematic. It's like, Socrates defended himself in the Apology. It's like, well, I can do, like, I can live, freely, like, all is possible. I don't have to worry about these laws. He didn't exactly say that, but it's sort of like, when you do doubt everything, you are doubting the authority and you're doubting the laws. So everything really is possible. Just like God is free to do things in heaven, which is a pretty strong statement. So I'm not super sure if I agree with that, but I thought that jumped out. Um, page 283. This is another thing I had a problem with. Irony as a spectator sport almost. Because life is a drama. It sounds almost like the Shakespeare, we're all actors in this drama. And the ironist is like a spectator of this, sort of like and it does feel like a smug superiority. It's like rising above it. My criticism though is that, if the ironist is a spectator in life, they kind of remove themselves from life. So aren't they missing out? Like, why are they even on Earth? Like, why don't they just kill themselves? Like, what's the point? At that point, if you're just like a spectator, like, you're not participating in life. So it seems like I don't know how to. I don't know if Kierkegaard gives an explanation for that here, but later on, I hope that we find that. Page 284. There's a few things that I highlighted here that are things that reminded me. I took a class a few years ago on Heidegger, and Heidegger definitely read Kierkegaard, and I think he stole a couple things and didn't credit him, because there's things that come out of this that are very reminiscent of this. Page 284 is talking about life is nothing for the ironist. Life is nothing but moods. That is very Heidegger, I thought. Like, but I mean, Kierkegaard is not the first person to talk about moods, but Heidegger definitely read Kierkegaard, so that might have been an inspiration. Another thing, irony on page 290. Irony cancels all actuality. It's also it's always put into perspective with possibilities, and that's very much Kierkegaardian too. Like, it's a life of possibility. Like, I have this freedom to choose these things, basically. So like, but the ironist is like, they're not bound by what is actual. They have all these possibilities. And almost coming, you just have a few more points on irony, and then we'll get into some Kierkegaardian themes, and then wrap it up because this video is going on way too long. Again, even though it is bite-sized Kierkegaard, so I apologize in advance. Page 318, there's a quote by Solge, Solge. Mysticism is the mother of irony. So there we are getting into sort of like the realm of mysticism beyond reason, which I alluded to before, which is somewhat worrying in a way, but it's interesting. Page 324, irony makes the poem and the poet free. Again, this overlap of the life of the poet and the life of the ironist. Uh, and some things I thought were maybe the most important things to take away from this. So, page 326, there's talk about, a difference between the ironist, the life of irony and the life of doubt, which are somewhat similar but distinct. Like science is kind of analogous to the life of doubt, like always doubting, always challenging. Um, but the life of irony is doubting and then something more, but it's more for the personal life. And again, like this is doing double duty as also a preview of coming attractions for Kierkegaard, because for Kierkegaard is dissatisfied because everything in his day is becoming a science. Even reading the Bible, this was like the start of biblical exegesis. Exegesis, I can't pronounce this, but basically, going back to the Bible and thinking like, or piecing it together and trying to analyze it and say like, what is the actual meaning of this? Learning the original biblical Greek, like basically taking a scientific approach to what had been before all just religious, which can bring out some good things. But Kierkegaard was kind of dissatisfied because saying that, like, for the life of the ironist is not science, is very different than science. And we'll get that again and again and again. And this is why I think Kierkegaard is still relevant today, because you hear a lot about this, like it's great. Yeah, we should focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. Like students should follow STEM fields and do nothing but STEM. But it's sort of like, science is a good thing and it'll get you a job for sure. But there's this whole other realm that science can't even talk about. Like, how should I live my life? What should I do in this situation? Ethics, like these important questions. Science can't touch these. Science doesn't talk about those. That's outside of the realm of science. And most importantly, how should I live my life? So, when 10 years go down the road after you graduate college and you're stressed out about life and you're pondering suicide possibly, it's like science is not really there to help you at that point. Science will prolong your life. Sometimes you should question, like, maybe I shouldn't even should I prolong my life? Like, what am I getting out of this? Sorry, that's a lot, but we'll see this again and again. It's the science versus how should I live my life, and these do map onto the objective versus the subjective. And we talk about objective truth. These are things that science is trying to get at. Subjective truth is sort of like, what does it mean for me to live my life? And subjective truth is, for Kierkegaard, it's very important because he's misinterpreted. He's not saying truth is relative. He's saying there are some truths that can only resonate with a subject, with an individual person. It's great that science is doing its own thing, trying to get at objective truth and approximating that and maybe getting near enough to that, but it's not even touching on these other questions. And that is the beginning of this. Like, this isn't even the start of Kierkegaard's authorship, but it's previewing those things. So we're going to definitely get into that. But yeah, I thought there was also an interesting thing here. There's no genuinely human life without irony. Wow, okay. Page 327, irony is a method to get to the truth, but it's not the truth itself. Like, okay, that's interesting. It's just a way to get there, but it's not, okay, this is what it's about. Like, this is just the first step on the way. Great. Okay, so now we're deep in the weeds here. But like, yeah, that covers everything about irony that stood out for me. So just some Kierkegaardian themes now. I'm just going to go through some of these things. Page 246, talk about busyness and solitude, very Kierkegaardian. Page 249, irony does not wish to be generally understood. In parentheses, in my own words, I put popularized. Like, there's an idea that, like, what it's about is this thing that's not popular. It's something that's not generalized. Page 261, there's some distinction between the ironist and the prophet. There's a lot of this sort of distinction, this versus this, which I think is mostly, it's probably more of a Hegelian thing almost, which was the dominant, philosophy of the time. But it's always interesting to say, like, okay, there's some differences here, and we'll get some more of that later on. Page 262, irony is freedom of contrast or freedom of constraint in infinity of possibilities. 264, some talk about alienation. I won't get into it. I don't have the time for it. But if you're interested, these are definitely like very existentialist Kierkegaardian themes. 289, page 289. There's a talk about an inward infinity that comes through resignation. And this is only this infinite is poetic. I think that's what I wrote. But this talk about resignation and resigning oneself to the way things are. A little bit of, let me see. There's an interesting thing here, which is kind of alluding to Schlegel, whose philosophy I'm not familiar with, but there's talk about an attempt to suspend all ethics. That is really foreshadowing fear and trembling when we talk about the teleological suspension of the ethical. I can hardly say that. Teleological suspension of the ethical. Okay, it's a mouthful, but that is jumping the gun, but it's a preview of coming attractions. Page 293, a very immediate preview. Talk about Don Juan, which anticipates either or. Don Juan is basically, this womanizing character who basically is Don Giovanni in Mozart's play Don Giovanni. And there's a very thick section of either or, which is dedicated to this, which is kind of funny. But he's talking about, go see Don Giovanni. Don Juan is this character, so he's very much in this thought. Page 301, the imitation of the poetic, aesthetic life. Again, the poetic is the aesthetic life. Page 303, there's a little language about marrying and acquiring. I'm going to bring this up because this is very Kierkegaard, and we're going to get this a few times. But remember, this is very relevant for Kierkegaard at the time because he had, I'm not sure if he proposed or he was soon to propose to his girlfriend at the time, which is going to set him down this path in life. I'll talk about that next video. But on page 303, we get a bit about this kind of one married, one lived for domesticity and one's position in society, one acquired children, acquired family worries, one stood in the full vigor of manhood, starred to notice in high places for one's benevolent activities, was an associate of the clergyman, under whose eyes one epically developed the most beautiful traits necessary for an honorable posthumous reputation. Blah 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 blah. It's all this sort of worldly desires and fame and all this. Marriage is part of that. It's about acquisitions and acquiring stuff. Page 304. The idea that poetry was good. And talking about poetry and romanticism, the movement of romanticism, and saying, okay, it's great that poetry kind of awakened people. But it's not really satisfying. It's sort of here's the start, but it's So, and on page 306, continuing that thought, it's kind of alluding to this, what we got before in criticism of Hans Christian Andersen, which was okay, here's this poetic character, but there's no overarching kind of theme or objective. It's just sort of I don't know how to describe it, but we'll see this more in either or. It's just sort of floating from one exciting thing to another thing without any really any purpose, basically. Lacking purpose, just sort of feeling the intensity of the pathos and all that stuff, which is great. That's great. Romanticism brought that out. Poetry awakens that, but it's not sufficient. There's something missing. So page 307, a little bit of this wandering night imagery again, which we'll definitely get some more of. Kind of like a Don Quixote figure, you can think of that. Page 325, contrasting the poet versus the genius, which is interesting. I think last time we did poet versus the prophet, and later on there's the genius versus the difference between a genius and a prophet, I believe it is, in his later works. We'll get to them. Everything summed up, 328. Um, Kierkegaard kind of thinks the task of his generation is to make science personal. This is what I was talking about before, too, that there's something lacking in this objective science. There's something lacking for the individual. Even today, this is a very relevant concern, I think. He goes, how should I live my life? Like, science doesn't really tell me that. It tells me how I can live a longer life by taking these pills and going, doing these operations, but it doesn't tell me how I should live that life. That doesn't come out of science. And there's something missing there. Page 329 puts the capstone on it at the very end, saying, it's a quoting Tertullian, which is saying, credo, I believe that it's absurd, credo quia absurdum, which I've heard said differently before. What is it? Credo et... No? I don't know Latin. But basically saying, I believe because it is absurd, which is kind of bizarre, sort of. But the idea that, like, this must have come from God because it's so outside of the realm of human reason. No human would invent this story because it's so absurd. It's so crazy. Which is like, what? You might be hearing this for the first time. You're like, that's not a good reason to, that's making me think it's invented by a crazy person. But it's the idea that it's beyond reason. It's into this mystical realm. And that is very much what, the same move that Zen Buddhism takes to. It's saying that we have these limitations that are clouding our vision. And we need to remove this and just go into the faith realm, and this is where Kierkegaard's going. So it's scary, and we're going, fear and trembling. It's going to be super scary because it's going to be like Abraham looks like he's super insane individual when we try to reason about him, and the idea is we can't really reason about him. Okay, that's a lot. I'm sorry this went on so long. But there's a lot to unpack here, and I wanted to get it out, and I think this is a summary of what I've read. There's a bit at the very end here, which I alluded to before, which I was kind of disappointed with, but it's an interesting historical tidbit, Schelling's Berlin lectures. So Kierkegaard's only trip outside of the country in his entire life. In his letters, he kind of wrote, hey, it turns out I love traveling. I'm going to do more of this. Sneak preview, he didn't. He just stayed in Copenhagen, but he liked it there. So he did take another trip in his life within Denmark. Not sure if it's before or after this, but yeah, he went to Berlin. He was listening to these lectures, and that was a super historical time. There was one of them. There's some other lecture quoted this. They said, some of the Marx brothers were there, and this is Engels basically, very tongue in cheek, but I like that because I like the Marx brothers. But Engels was there listening, and there's some other important people there listening to these lectures. Kierkegaard kind of wrote in his journal that he was kind of disappointed, and there's kind of like a lot of nonsense and stuff, but there's a lot of interesting things that came out of this. Yeah, I kind of skipped through it, and it's just like a condensed version of lecture notes over actually a couple weeks time. So there's not a lot that I could really get out of this, but like there's some things that jumped out. I thought especially the things I want to highlight about negative philosophy. Schelling was definitely talking about negative versus positive philosophy, which is a theme that comes up a lot in here. So it felt like this is a thing that people are talking about at the time. This is very relevant for the conversation. So on page 344, he's kind of saying Kant is in a way a negative philosophy, and I'm not super sure if I agree with that. I don't think Kierkegaard's definition of what negative philosophy actually is would say that, because Kant definitely built up, a system of sorts. Page 354 to 355 talk about positive and negative philosophy again. Page 358 talk about Aristotle being a negative philosopher, which is like, I'm not sure that fits into Kierkegaard's definition again, but Schelling's definition maybe. Talk about on 362 the negative philosophy. A system is completed in itself, but maybe not. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's talking about the idea that positive philosophy is a big system, and it takes a lot to complete the system. It turns out no one can really like, but like the negative philosophy, everything is kind of complete in itself, and it's not really a system. He kind of admits on the next sentence, page 366. Positive philosophy is kind of contained in the negative philosophy as a possibility. And so I thought, like, okay, yeah, there's a lot, the Kierkegaard language that we just read kind of brings that out. Negative philosophy is all about these possibilities. It's making all these possibilities available. And one of this is, this positive philosophy that might come out of it. This system might be the next step after that point, after you break down everything. And then a little bit of talk on 369 about negative philosophy and potency. I think potency in the sense of potential, again, the possibilities of things. Okay. Oh, and some interesting things that reminded me of Heidegger as well. But I think Heidegger was really influenced by, there's talk of Dasein on 340. Heidegger, I think, was really influenced by this idealism, and trying to revive it in a way. And this is all German idealism. Idea that on page 37 that being precedes thought. Heidegger would kind of anticipate this and say it's like, yeah, maybe being, but not being as is, like Dasein, like my own being, my own, like brain structure. This is my, this is everything, presupposed before I experience the world. And this is this is a subject in itself, but it's sort of like against Descartes' philosophy. This was a big problem, which is German idealism tried to solve this, but this was a big problem since at least Descartes, and maybe before even, the idea of the subject versus the object, like me versus the world, and that, like, I'm perceiving the world through my senses, but I could be deceived. And Descartes, tries to eliminate everything that might deceive him. And he wants to break down everything into clear and distinct ideas and say, like, everything that's gone before me, all this scholasticism garbage about angels dancing on the heads of pins, like all this stuff, like, it turns out we haven't made any progress. So I'm just going to tear down everything. I'm trying to eliminate all sources of that might be illusory. I'm trying to doubt everything until I come to the thing that I cannot doubt, which is that cogito ergo sum. I can't doubt myself. There must be a self to be asking that question. Anyway, like this you can read more about this because I'm not doing it justice, but this was like throwing a grenade into philosophy, because everything that came after this to the current day really is this problem of like the subject versus the object, and like how can we actually be sure we can't actually directly experience the world. There's always this outside world. And so German idealism tries to deal with this in some way that Heidegger tries to take, but in any case, like it's a problem we're stuck with since this time. But yeah, I thought that's interesting. But there's some talk about that in Schelling's lectures about there's this problem about the subject versus the object, and trying to get to the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. Horribly mispronouncing that, but I kind of just yabbered on about all this. But there's a lot of stuff going on here. I would recommend probably skipping these Berlin lectures, but it's a historical artifact, which is interesting. Shows what's going on at the time, so what people are talking about. So, and Kierkegaard is not in total isolation, obviously. So it kind of helps put some of his thoughts in perspective. And as I said, it's mostly that negative versus positive philosophy. That's what I got out of it. That helped me understand it more. So, all that being said, this was a large bite today, but we've made it through the concept of irony. And according to the chronological order on the back here, the next book in our series is Either Or, which was one of Kierkegaard's most famous works. Probably his most famous, Either Or, and the concluding unscientific postscript, and Fear and Trembling. I say all of those are probably his most notable, not necessarily his best or my favorites, but Yeah, either or is a trip. So looking forward to talking about it. And I've just started reading it. So looking forward to talking about that next time if you'll join me. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, thank you for uh, going through this. If you made it to the end, we've made a lot of progress. We're actually on the cusp of Kierkegaard's actual official authorship. We've made it. So so I hope you join me next time. Uh, Thank you, and I'll see you next time, hopefully. Well, thank you. Bye.